November 1976. Princess Anne stood at the wrought-iron gates of a Georgian manor house in the Cotswolds, unaware that she was about to become the custodian of one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets. The estate her mother had just purchased for her as a wedding gift looked peaceful enough from the approach. Honey-coloured stone glowing in the weak winter sun, perfectly manicured grounds rolling into the distance like a green ocean frozen in gentle waves. Ancient oak trees lined the drive, their bare November branches creating a Gothic canopy overhead. In the distance, the house itself rose from the landscape with the mathematical perfection that only Georgian architecture could achieve. 9 bays of golden Cotswold limestone, perfectly proportioned windows reflecting the pale sky, a classical pediment crowning the central entrance like a temple to good taste and old money. But beneath those verdant lawns, beneath the gravel drives and manicured hedges, beneath the very foundations of that beautiful house, lay something that would ensure Gatcombe Park remained forever closed to the public, sealed away from prying eyes by royal decree, protected by state secrecy laws, and guarded more carefully than almost any other property in the royal portfolio. This is the story of an estate worth over £200 million today, a property that has never appeared on any official palace tour, never opened its doors for charity events, never welcomed the public through its gates even for garden parties or historical society visits, while Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral, and even Clarence House all welcome visitors during certain times of the year. Gatcombe Park remains resolutely private, its gates permanently closed, its interior unseen by anyone outside the immediate royal circle and essential staff. And the reason why has remained one of the British monarchy's most carefully kept secrets for nearly half a century, protected by layers of official classification, royal privilege, and deliberate silence. To understand what lies beneath Gatcombe Park, we must journey back 2.5 centuries to a time when this corner of Gloucestershire was home not to royalty, but to a man whose fortune was built on an industry far darker than most could imagine, an industry that made Britain wealthy beyond measure, while inflicting suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. This is the story of Gatcombe Park, a house that refuses to reveal its past, even as it shelters the future of the British crown, a monument to Georgian elegance built on foundations of human misery, a beautiful facade concealing chambers that have been sealed for over 200 years. The year was 1771. Georgian England was at the height of its imperial power, bestriding the world like a colossus of trade, manufacturing, and military might. The 7 Years' War had ended in 1763 with Britain triumphant, having seized vast territories in India, Canada, and the Caribbean. The Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum in the Midlands and North, transforming Britain from an agricultural nation into the workshop of the world. And nowhere was this new wealth more visible than in the country houses springing up across the English landscape. These were not the ancient castles of medieval lords, built for defence and fortification, nor the sprawling Tudor piles erected by families close to the crown. These were monuments to a new kind of wealth, commercial fortunes made in trade, manufacturing, and empire, built by men who had started with nothing and clawed their way to riches through ambition, ruthlessness, and a willingness to profit from industries that more squeamish souls might avoid. Among the men building these palaces of the new age was Edward Shepherd, a Bristol merchant whose name appeared in ledgers from Kingston to Calcutta, from Liverpool to Lagos, from Charleston to Cape Coast Castle. To his neighbours in Gloucestershire, Shepherd was simply a successful businessman, a pillar of the community who had earned the right to build himself a proper country seat, to take his place among the landed gentry, to transform himself from mere merchant to gentleman. He was respectable, generous with local charities, regular in his church attendance, and sociable in his habits. But the truth of how Edward Shepherd accumulated his enormous fortune was something he took great pains to obscure, bearing it as deeply as he would later bury other secrets beneath the foundations of his grand new home. Edward Shepherd was born in 1720 in the port city of Bristol, the third son of a minor merchant who dealt in textiles and tobacco. Bristol in the early 18th century was England's second city after London, a bustling hub of Atlantic trade where fortunes could be made by those willing to take risks and ask few questions about the origins of their cargo. The city's docks teemed with activity from dawn to dusk. Ships from the Caribbean unloading hogsheads of sugar and barrels of rum, vessels bound for Africa taking on manufactured goods and textiles, merchantmen from the Americas bringing tobacco, rice and indigo. The smell of the docks was overwhelming. Tar and hemp from the rope walks, sugar and molasses from the warehouses, the salt tang of the sea mixing with the acrid smoke from iron forges, and the sickly sweet scent of the slave ships that nobody spoke about in polite company, but everyone knew were the foundation of Bristol's prosperity. Young Edward was apprenticed at 14 to a shipping merchant named Thomas Henderson, learning the intricacies of maritime commerce, how to read tidal charts and calculate the best times for departure and arrival, how to assess ships' cargo capacity and trim, how to calculate insurance premiums based on route and season and vessel quality, how to negotiate with captains and cargo masters and customs officials. But more importantly, he learned which questions not to ask, which manifests not to examine too closely, which holds to leave uninspected, which conversations to forget the moment they ended. Henderson was what was euphemistically called a guinea trader, which meant his ships carried manufactured goods to West Africa, enslaved people across the Atlantic, and sugar and tobacco back to England. It was a business that required a strong stomach and a flexible conscience, but it was also the most profitable trade in the British Empire. By 1745, at just 25 years old, Shepherd had saved enough from his wages and judicious investments to purchase a 1/8 share in a merchant vessel, the Bristol Hope, a 3-masted ship of 200 tons burden built in the yards at Pill. The ship made the triangular route that was making Bristol rich and powerful, manufactured goods, primarily textiles, guns and metalware, to West Africa, where they were traded for human beings captured in the interior or purchased from coastal kingdoms, then the long middle passage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean or American colonies, and finally the return journey laden with sugar, rum, tobacco, rice and other plantation products. The profits from a single successful voyage could be as much as 300% of the initial investment. A ship that sailed with £10,000 worth of cargo could return with goods worth £30,000 or more. Over the next decade, Shepherd reinvested every penny of profit into expanding his maritime empire. By 1755, he owned shares in 7 ships: the Bristol Hope, the African Queen, the Minerva, the Providence, the Blessing, the Fortune and the Rebecca. 4 of these he owned outright, while in the other 3 he held partnerships with other Bristol merchants. His vessels were making regular runs between Bristol, the Bight of Benin and the Gold Coast in West Africa, the islands of Jamaica and Barbados, and the ports of Charleston and Savannah in the American colonies. The human cost of this trade was staggering. Historians estimate that Shepherd's ships transported over 12,000 enslaved Africans across the Atlantic between 1745 and 1770, with mortality rates on his vessels averaging 20% during the crossing, significantly higher than the already horrific industry average of 15%. This meant that approximately 2,400 people died aboard Shepherd's ships, their bodies thrown overboard to the sharks that learned to follow the slave ships across the Atlantic. The conditions below decks were nightmarish: men, women and children chained in spaces so confined they could barely move, lying in their own filth, breathing air so foul that crew members could only stand it for minutes at a time, subsisting on minimal rations of rice or yams and brackish water. But it was not just the slave trade itself that built Shepherd's fortune. He had a particular genius for diversification and vertical integration that would have impressed modern business strategists. He owned sugar plantations in Jamaica, on the fertile north coast near Montego Bay, staffed by the same enslaved people his ships transported. These plantations, totaling over 3,000 acres, produced raw sugar and molasses that his ships carried back to England. He owned the refineries in Bristol that processed the raw sugar into the white crystals that graced British tea tables, and the rum distilleries that transformed molasses into the spirit that the Royal Navy rationed to its sailors. He owned shares in the textile mills of Lancashire that produced the cloth shipped to Africa to trade for human beings. Every step of the cycle generated profit, and every profit was reinvested into expanding the system, creating a vertically integrated empire that controlled everything from the manufacture of trade goods to their exchange for human beings, the transportation of those people across the ocean, their labour on Caribbean plantations, and the processing and sale of the products their labour created. By 1760, Edward Shepherd was one of the wealthiest men in Bristol, his fortune estimated at over £80,000, equivalent to approximately £150 million in today's money, accounting not just for inflation, but for the relative value of that wealth in an economy far smaller than our own. To put this in perspective, £80,000 in 1760 could buy entire estates of thousands of acres, employ hundreds of people, or fund commercial ventures of enormous scale. Shepherd sat on the Bristol Corporation, wielding enormous influence in the city's political life. He had the ear of members of Parliament, whose campaigns he funded generously. He was a vestryman of St Mary Redcliffe, one of Bristol's grandest churches. He was a patron of the Bristol Infirmary, contributing hundreds of pounds annually to its charitable work. He dined with admirals and generals, with merchants and bankers, with anyone who mattered in the commercial and political life of Georgian England. He had become, in the parlance of the age, a gentleman of substance, and gentlemen of substance required country estates, not just as investments or sources of agricultural income, but as visible proof of their ascent into the ranks of the landed gentry, as physical manifestations of their wealth and taste and permanence. In 1768, Shepherd began his search for land. He wanted something within reasonable distance of Bristol, close enough to oversee his business interests personally, to return to the city when major decisions needed to be made or important meetings required his presence, but far enough to escape the smoke and noise of the port city, the cramped streets and the constant bustle of commerce. He wanted acreage sufficient for a proper park in the English landscape style that was currently fashionable, with rolling lawns, carefully placed copses of trees, serpentine lakes, and distant prospects that appeared natural but were in fact carefully engineered. He wanted productive farmland that could generate income from crops and livestock, making the estate at least partially self-sustaining. And he wanted a location that would announce his arrival among the landed gentry of England, a house and grounds that would stand comparison with the seats of baronets and viscounts, a property that would erase any lingering taint of the counting house and the warehouse. He found what he sought in the village of Minchinhampton in Gloucestershire, about 30 miles northeast of Bristol, easily reachable by coach in a day's journey. The land occupied an enviable position in the Cotswolds, that range of limestone hills running northeast from Bath to Chipping Campden, famous for its honey-coloured stone, its wealthy wool merchants, and its gently undulating landscape of incomparable beauty. The specific site had been held by a series of minor gentry families, most recently the Readings, who could trace their ownership back to Elizabethan times, but who had fallen on hard times through a combination of bad management, gambling debts, and the agricultural depression that plagued English farming in the mid-18th century. The Reading family was eager to sell, willing to accept less than market value to settle pressing debts and avoid the social humiliation of foreclosure. Shepherd purchased 730 acres for the sum of £15,000 in March 1771, acquiring not just land, but all the rights and privileges that went with it, timber rights, mineral rights, hunting and fishing rights, and the informal but very real social status that came with being a significant landowner in a wealthy county. The acreage included a mixture of parkland, agricultural fields, ancient woodland and meadows, along a small river that would prove perfect for the ornamental water features that landscape fashion demanded. Within weeks of completing the purchase, Shepherd had engaged surveyors to map every inch of his new property, landscape designers to plan the park and gardens, agricultural consultants to advise on improving the farmland's productivity, and most importantly, an architect to design his mansion. For his architect, Shepherd initially approached several London-based designers whose names appeared regularly in the society pages, men like Robert Adam, whose neoclassical style was conquering fashionable London, or Sir William Chambers, whose work for the royal family had made him the most prestigious architect in England. But these men's fees were enormous, their waiting lists extended for years, and their aristocratic clientele meant they were not always eager to work for wealthy merchants still tainted by the smell of trade, no matter how rich those merchants might be. Instead, Shepherd chose a local man named George Bassevi, a Bristol architect who had designed several respectable houses in the city and had a reputation for classical correctness and reasonable fees. However, architectural historians now believe that the true designer of Gatcombe Park may have been John Wood the Younger of Bath, one of the most accomplished architects of the Georgian period, who possibly worked through Besevi as a front, providing the actual designs while allowing the local man to take public credit. This arrangement would have suited everyone. Wood would have been paid handsomely without the social complication of working directly for a slave trader. Besevi would gain credit for a major house that enhanced his reputation, and Shepherd would effectively get a Wood design at a fraction of what hiring him directly would have cost. Whoever the true designer, the house that rose from the Gloucestershire clay between 1771 and 1774 was a masterpiece of Georgian restraint and proportion, a building that perfectly captured the architectural ideals of its age. Built in the Palladian style that had dominated English architecture since the early 18th century, Gatcombe Park eschewed the Baroque extravagance popular on the continent, the twisting columns, the theatrical facades, the overwhelming ornamentation, in favour of classical symmetry, mathematical proportion, and understated elegance. The house was constructed of local Cotswold limestone, that distinctive honey-coloured stone formed from compressed marine organisms millions of years ago, which gave it a warm glow that seemed to absorb and radiate sunlight. This limestone was quarried from deposits near Painswick, about 8 miles distant, where generations of stonemasons had developed expertise in working this beautiful but temperamental material. Cotswold limestone is relatively soft when first quarried, making it easy to cut and carve, but it hardens on exposure to air, becoming durable enough to last centuries. However, it required skilled handling. Cut it wrong and the stone would split along its natural bedding planes, ruining weeks of work and wasting expensive material. The main block of the house stood 2.5 stories tall, measuring 90 feet across its main facade, 9 bays wide with a central 3-bay projection that broke forward from the main wall plane and was topped by a triangular pediment supported by 4 Ionic columns. This projection served both aesthetic and practical purposes. Aesthetically, it provided vertical emphasis and relief from the horizontal expanse of the facade, while practically it created a clearly defined entrance and provided additional floor space in the rooms behind. The pediment itself was adorned with Shepherd's newly commissioned coat of arms, carved in high relief from the same Cotswold limestone. This coat of arms was an invention, of course. Shepherd had no ancestral right to armorial bearings, but the College of Arms, that ancient institution that controlled heraldry in England, was always willing to grant arms to wealthy men for appropriate fees. Shepherd's arms featured maritime elements, a ship in full sail, an anchor and dolphins, that alluded to the source of his wealth, while carefully avoiding any explicit reference to exactly what cargo those ships had carried. The windows were perfectly proportioned sash designs, their glazing bars forming geometric patterns that changed with the architectural hierarchy of the facade. The ground floor windows were the largest, reflecting the importance of the principal reception rooms they illuminated. The first floor windows were slightly smaller, appropriate for bedrooms and private apartments. The second floor windows, lighting servants' quarters and storage spaces, were smaller still. This gradation in window size was not just practical, but aesthetic, creating a visual rhythm that the educated eye of a Georgian gentleman would immediately recognize and appreciate as evidence of architectural sophistication and correct classical taste. Each window was set into a simple stone surround with a flat lintel above and a projecting sill below, the simplicity of the detailing allowing the proportion and rhythm of the windows themselves to create the visual effect. The roof was of Welsh slate, that blue-grey stone that had been used for roofing in Britain since medieval times, and that provided superior weather protection compared to the clay tiles more common in southern England. The roofline was punctuated by chimney stacks serving the numerous fireplaces within. A Georgian house of this size would have had fireplaces in virtually every significant room, requiring a forest of chimneys that were carefully arranged in symmetrical groups to maintain the classical composition of the building. The eaves were adorned with modillions, small brackets carved with classical motifs that supported a deep cornice running the entire perimeter of the building, creating a strong horizontal line that emphasized the house's breadth and stability. the construction required a workforce that at its peak numbered over 200 men, an enormous concentration of skilled labour that had to be recruited from across the region and beyond. Stonemasons were brought from Bath and Bristol, their skills essential for working the local limestone, which, while beautiful, was notoriously difficult to cut and dress properly. These master masons earned premium wages, up to 3 shillings a day, compared to the shilling or less that unskilled labourers might make, and they jealously guarded the secrets of their craft, passing knowledge down from master to apprentice in a tradition stretching back to medieval guilds. Carpenters came from the Forest of Dean, that vast ancient woodland between the Severn and Wye rivers, where generations of woodsmen had developed unparalleled expertise in selecting, seasoning and working English oak. These carpenters were responsible for everything from the structural roof timbers, massive beams hewn from trees that might have been centuries old, to the delicate joinery of window frames, doors and interior panelling. Plasterers were recruited from London, needed for the elaborate ceiling work that Shepherd demanded for his principal rooms, work that required artistic skill as well as technical knowledge of how to model decorative elements in wet plaster before it's set. The logistics of the construction were formidable and required planning worthy of a military campaign. Each block of limestone had to be hauled from the Painswick quarries, about 8 miles distant, along roads that were little better than muddy tracks for much of the year. In wet weather, wagons could become mired for days, their loads of carefully cut stone risking damage if they shifted or fell. Shepherd invested in improving the roads between the quarries and his building site, paying for drainage ditches to be dug and gravel to be laid, an investment that benefited not just his construction project, but the entire local economy. Timber came from multiple sources: structural oak from Shepherd's own newly acquired woodland on the estate, supplemented by purchases from the Forest of Dean, while exotic woods for fine joinery arrived by wagon from Bristol docks, having been shipped from the Caribbean, Central America and North America. Mahogany from Jamaica and Honduras, walnut from Virginia, maple from New England, these luxury timbers, produced by enslaved labour on plantations Shepherd sometimes owned, travelled thousands of miles to be transformed into panelling, doors and furniture for his English country house. The irony would have been lost on no one at the time, though few would have dared speak it aloud. The same ships that carried human beings into slavery returned with the wood to furnish the houses of the men who had enslaved them. Other materials arrived from even more distant sources. Marble for fireplaces and flooring came from quarries in Italy, shipped through Leghorn to Bristol, and then hauled inland by wagon. This Italian marble ranged from pure white Carrara marble for the most important spaces to more colourful varieties: Verde Antico green marble, Rosso Verona red marble, Giallo Siena yellow marble, used for decorative inlays and accents. The marble work alone represented an investment of thousands of pounds, and required Italian craftsmen to be brought to Gloucestershire to cut, polish and install the stone. Lead for roofing, gutters and downpipes came from the Mendip Hills in Somerset, where lead had been mined since Roman times. Glass for the windows was manufactured in Bristol and carefully transported in special wagons with heavy padding to prevent breakage during the jolting journey along rough roads. Iron for hinges, locks, gates and structural reinforcement came from the forges of South Wales, where coal and iron ore lay conveniently close together, fueling the nascent industrial revolution that was beginning to transform Britain. But it was what lay beneath the house that makes Gatcombe Park unique among Georgian estates, and that has been the source of mystery, speculation and deliberate concealment for 2.5 centuries. As the foundations were being dug in the summer of 1771, Edward Shepherd gave orders that puzzled and disturbed even his most trusted builders. Beneath the main house, he wanted not just the typical Georgian basement for kitchens and servants' quarters, but an extensive network of cellars, tunnels and underground chambers extending far beyond the footprint of the house itself, reaching out into the parkland in multiple directions, descending to multiple levels below ground, creating a subterranean world as extensive as the visible house above. The official explanation was wine storage. A gentleman of Shepherd's wealth and social ambitions would naturally require capacious cellars for his wines, brandies, ports and other spirits. A well-stocked Georgian cellar might contain thousands of bottles, representing not just current drinking stock, but wines laid down to age for years or decades, Madeira and port that would improve with time, clarets and burgundies from the finest French estates. And indeed, the main cellar beneath the house was fitted out exactly as one would expect. Racks capable of holding thousands of bottles, constructed from oak with each bottle resting at a slight downward angle to keep the cork moist, bins for organising wines by type and vintage, a tasting area with a table and chairs where Shepherd could sample wines with visitors or his steward. But the tunnels extended much further, far beyond what any reasonable wine collection would require. One tunnel ran nearly 200 feet from the house toward the estate's eastern boundary wall, following a carefully engineered course that maintained a slight upward gradient to ensure drainage. Another descended in a spiral, like the stairs of a medieval tower, but inverted into the earth, going down at least 2 levels below the main cellar, possibly 3. The full extent was never documented and remains unknown. A third branched in multiple directions from a central chamber, creating a subterranean maze beneath the lawns and gardens, with passages running north toward the stables, south toward what would become the ornamental lake, and west toward a copse of trees that concealed one of several concealed exits. The construction of these underground spaces required specialized labor and techniques quite different from building the house above. Shepherd brought in miners from the Mendip Hills in Somerset, men experienced in working underground in the lead mines that had been operating there since Roman times. These miners knew how to shore up tunnels with timber supports, how to assess rock stability, how to prevent collapse, how to ensure adequate ventilation in confined spaces, and how to work in darkness with only candles or oil lamps for illumination. They were paid generously, double or even triple the wages of surface workers, and they were paid to keep silent. Shepherd made each man sign a document swearing not to discuss the work, with substantial financial penalties for violation. He also paid bonuses upon completion, creating a financial incentive for discretion that most workmen would have found difficult to refuse. Local legend, recorded in the parish records of Minchinhampton and in letters and diaries of local gentry families, speaks of workers who disappeared during the construction of Gatcombe, though whether this was due to construction accidents, always a risk in underground work where tunnel collapse could bury men alive, deliberate silencing by Shepherd's agents, or simply labourers moving on to other jobs remains unclear and will probably never be known with certainty. What is certain is that the underground network at Gatcombe was far more extensive than any normal Georgian house would require, or than most people even today realise. Modern ground-penetrating radar surveys, conducted discreetly in the 1990s after subsidence concerns were raised in one section of the park, revealed that the tunnels extend over an area of nearly 3 acres, with at least 3 distinct levels, possibly 4 in some areas, reaching depths of up to 50 feet below the surface. The radar also revealed the presence of multiple chambers of varying sizes, from small rooms no bigger than a closet to larger spaces comparable to the reception rooms of the house above. In the 1770s, such construction would have cost thousands of pounds beyond the already substantial budget for the house itself, probably an additional £10,000 to £15,000, a sum that could have purchased several more farms or built an entire village of cottages. Why would Shepherd have gone to such expense? What purpose could such an elaborate underground complex serve? The answer lies in the nature of his business and the times in which he lived, an era when fortunes could be made with breathtaking speed, but could also vanish with equal rapidity, when political winds could shift suddenly, when a man who was wealthy and respected one day might find himself bankrupted or imprisoned the next. By the late 1760s, the abolitionist movement was beginning to gain strength in England, challenging the moral foundations of the slave trade that had enriched cities like Bristol and Liverpool and made fortunes for men like Shepherd. Men like Granville Sharp, a civil servant who had taken up the cause of enslaved people in England, were publishing pamphlets detailing the horrors of the Middle Passage, describing in graphic detail the conditions aboard slave ships, the mortality rates, the brutal treatment of human beings as mere cargo. Thomas Clarkson, a young Cambridge graduate, was travelling the country collecting evidence about the slave trade, interviewing sailors, examining ships, gathering the testimony that would eventually help bring down the entire system. Former enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano were beginning to publish their autobiographies, first-person accounts of capture, enslavement, the Middle Passage, and life on the plantations. Testimony that was far more powerful than any abstract moral argument could be. While the slave trade would not be abolished until 1807, and slavery itself not until 1833, the moral and political climate was shifting in ways that made wealthy slave traders like Shepherd increasingly uncomfortable. The certainty that had characterized the early and middle parts of the century, the unquestioned assumption that the slave trade was a legitimate and even beneficial commerce, was giving way to doubt, questioning, and moral criticism. Wealthy men who had built their fortunes on slavery were increasingly uncomfortable with public scrutiny of exactly how that wealth had been accumulated. They began to diversify their investments, shifting money from the slave trade into land, government bonds, manufacturing enterprises, and other ventures that carried less moral taint. They began to construct public identities as country gentlemen, charitable benefactors, and pillars of society, identities that carefully obscured or minimized their involvement in the slave trade. Some, like Shepherd, began to fear that political winds might shift more dramatically, that Parliament might not just abolish the slave trade, but confiscate the assets of those who had profited from it, that uncomfortable questions might be asked about the sources of their wealth and how it had been acquired. These were not paranoid fantasies. There were precedents for such action in English history, cases where fortunes had been seized, estates confiscated, and wealthy men reduced to poverty by parliamentary action or judicial decree. The tunnels at Gatcombe, historians now believe, served multiple purposes, forming a complex system designed to protect Shepherd's wealth and possibly his freedom. First, they were indeed used for storage, but not just of wine. Documents discovered in Bristol archives in the 1980s, when the papers of the Bristol Corporation were being catalogued and digitised, show that Shepherd maintained significant quantities of gold and silver bullion in his possession, proceeds from his trading ventures that he preferred to keep out of banks where they might be tracked, taxed, or seized. In an era before central banking, before secure vaults and deposit insurance, wealthy men often kept substantial assets in physical form on their own properties. Gold sovereigns, silver ingots, uncut gemstones from the East Indies trade, even bags of Spanish silver dollars, these portable forms of wealth could be hidden away, moved quickly if necessary, and were beyond the reach of creditors or authorities unless actually discovered. The deeper chambers at Gatcombe, with their thick stone walls, controlled temperature and humidity, and multiple layers of locked doors, provided secure storage for these assets. Shepherd's estate inventory from 1806 lists sundry assets held in secure storage valued at over £30,000, an enormous sum that has never been fully accounted for in surviving records. Where was this wealth stored? The most likely answer is in the sealed chambers beneath Gatcombe Park. Second, the tunnels may have served as a contingency escape route. The tunnel that runs toward the boundary wall emerges, or at least emerged before being sealed in the 20th century, in a copse of trees nearly a quarter-mile from the house, far enough to allow an escape in the event of civil unrest or an arrest. Remember that this was an era when fortunes could be lost overnight, when political allegiances could turn deadly, when even wealthy men might find themselves on the wrong side of power and facing imprisonment or worse. The Gordon riots of 1780, when anti-Catholic mobs rampaged through London for days, destroying property and attacking anyone associated with Catholic emancipation, showed how quickly civil order could break down even in the capital. Rural estates were even more vulnerable to attack by smugglers, highway robbers, or angry mobs protesting enclosures or high food prices. An escape tunnel that would allow Shepherd and his family to flee the house undetected, emerging at a concealed exit where horses could be waiting, might have seemed like prudent insurance in an unstable age. But there is a third, darker possibility that has emerged from recent historical research, archaeological investigation, and the kind of evidence that authorities have worked very hard to keep from public view. In 2003, during archaeological work connected to routine maintenance on the estate's water and drainage systems, workers uncovered something disturbing in one of the sealed chambers that had been opened due to structural concerns about water infiltration. What they found has never been publicly disclosed in full, but the archaeologists who made the discovery, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity to protect themselves from potential legal action under official secrets laws, described finding manacles and chains mounted on the walls at intervals, suggesting they were designed to restrain multiple human beings simultaneously. The chamber in question was approximately 20 feet square with an 8-foot ceiling, carved from the solid limestone bedrock with walls that had been plastered and whitewashed at some point in the distant past. Iron rings were set into the walls at roughly 6-foot intervals at a height of about 4 feet from the floor, perfect for securing chains. The manacles themselves, heavily corroded but still identifiable, were of a type used in the 18th century, with crude locks and minimal concern for the comfort or safety of whoever wore them. Alongside the restraints, the archaeologists found evidence of long-term human habitation that was clearly not voluntary. Crude bedding, consisting of straw mattresses that had long since rotted to fragments, wooden buckets that had served as chamber pots, and most disturbing of all, scratches on the walls that appeared to be attempts to mark the passage of time, groups of 5 lines crossed by a 6th, the traditional tally mark system that prisoners and captives have used throughout history to track their days of confinement. The implications are chilling and raise questions that the British establishment has shown no interest in answering. Was Edward Shepherd using the tunnels beneath Gatcombe to hold people, possibly enslaved people he was hiding from authorities or holding before transport, possibly debtors or enemies he wished to make disappear, possibly individuals who had displeased him in some way and were being punished? The historical context makes several scenarios possible, though none can be proven with certainty, given the deliberate destruction and concealment of evidence. One possibility is that Shepherd was holding enslaved people at Gatcombe, either temporarily before shipping them to plantations or as a more permanent arrangement. While slavery was not formally legal in England by the 1770s, the famous Somerset case of 1772 had established that slavery had never been explicitly authorised by English law, and that enslaved people could not be forcibly removed from England against their will. The reality was more complex. Wealthy men who owned plantations in the Caribbean often brought enslaved servants back to England with them, and the legal status of these people remained ambiguous. Some managed to escape or gain their freedom through the courts, but others remained in what was effectively bondage. It is possible that Shepherd was holding people he considered his property in the chambers beneath Gatcombe, keeping them out of sight to avoid legal complications or moral criticism. Another possibility is even darker. There are fragmentary references in anti-slavery literature from the period to enslaved people who disappeared while in England, who were brought to the country by their owners and then vanished without explanation. Some abolitionist writers allege that slave traders and plantation owners were murdering enslaved people who attempted to claim their freedom or who became inconvenient in other ways. Could the chamber beneath Gatcombe have been used for such a purpose, a place to hold people before they were killed or shipped out of the country against their will? A third possibility relates to Shepherd's business operations. The slave trade was not just brutal, but incredibly dangerous for everyone involved, including the traders themselves. Ships' crews often mutinied, captains embezzled cargo or profits, business partners betrayed each other, and competitors used violence or intimidation to gain advantage. Shepherd may have used the underground chambers to detain business associates who had betrayed him, debtors who couldn't pay, or competitors he wanted to intimidate. In an age when the rule of law was far weaker than today, when wealthy men wielded enormous private power, such private imprisonment was not unknown. We will likely never know the full truth. The chamber was resealed within days of its discovery, with the work done not by normal contractors but by a specialised team brought in under security protocols. The Princess Royal's office issued a terse statement that routine maintenance had been completed with no findings of historical significance, a statement that was demonstrably false given what the archaeologists had found. The workers who discovered the chamber were required to sign non-disclosure agreements with severe financial penalties for violation. The archaeologists themselves were warned that discussing their findings could result in prosecution under the Official Secrets Act, the broad statute that the British government uses to protect classified information, and that has been applied in increasingly expansive ways over the decades. But the discovery adds a sinister dimension to the grandeur of the house above, a reminder that Georgian elegance and classical proportion could coexist with cruelty and oppression, that the same man who could appreciate fine architecture and collect tasteful artwork could also own human beings and profit from their suffering. This duality is central to understanding both Gatcombe Park specifically and the Georgian era more generally. It was an age of extraordinary artistic and intellectual achievement, the age of Handel and Gainsborough, of Samuel Johnson and Adam Smith, of elegant architecture and beautiful design. But it was also an age built on slavery, colonial exploitation, and brutal class hierarchy, an age when millions laboured in chains so that a few thousand could live in palatial comfort. Construction of Gatcombe Park was completed in late 1774, just in time for Shepherd and his family to celebrate Christmas in their new home. The final cost was just over £32,000 for the house itself, approximately £50 million in today's money, accounting for inflation and relative economic scale, with additional expenditure on the underground works, landscaping, furnishing, and other costs, bringing the total investment to somewhere between £45,000 and £50,000, a truly enormous sum that represented a substantial portion of Shepherd's fortune. For that sum, Edward Shepherd had acquired one of the finest Georgian houses in Gloucestershire, a residence that announced his arrival among the landed gentry and that would, he hoped, establish his family among the permanent upper classes of England. Let me take you on a tour of what he built, walking through the spaces as a visitor in the 1770s might have experienced them, seeing the house at the height of its original glory before the modifications, updates and changes that later centuries would bring. Approaching the house from the main drive, which winds through the parkland in carefully contrived curves, designed to build anticipation and present the house from its most flattering angles, the first impression is one of perfect proportional harmony. The facade stretches 90 feet across, its 9 bays creating a rhythm that draws the eye naturally to the central entrance, where the forward projection and pediment provide emphasis and grandeur. This entrance is framed by 4 Ionic columns, the second of the 3 classical orders, more elaborate than simple Doric, but more restrained than ornate Corinthian, supporting a triangular pediment carved with Shepherd's coat of arms. The columns are not load-bearing structural elements, but rather decorative, applied to the facade to create a classical temple front motif that was considered the height of architectural sophistication in Georgian England. The honey-coloured Cotswold limestone seems to absorb and radiate light, creating a warm glow that changes throughout the day. At dawn, when the sun rises in the east, the facade blazes golden, each tiny crystal of calcite in the limestone catching and refracting the light. At midday, under the high sun, the colour softens to cream and butter. At sunset, when the western sky fills with colour, the facade deepens to amber and rust, sometimes even taking on rosy tones that make the stone appear almost flesh-like. Mounting the broad steps to the entrance, 7 steps, a number carefully chosen for its proportional relationship to the door height and the column spacing, a visitor would pass through a doorway framed in the same limestone, with a fanlight above allowing natural light to enter the hallway beyond. The door itself was solid oak planks several inches thick, hung on massive iron hinges forged in Bristol, and polished to a dark gleam, with brass furniture including a heavy knocker in the shape of a lion's head, the symbol of British strength and courage. Entering through this door, visitors stepped into an entrance hall designed to proclaim Shepherd's status and taste immediately, before they had taken more than a few steps into the house. The dimensions of the hall were carefully calculated, 30 feet square and 20 feet high, creating a cubic volume that had pleasing proportional relationships, and that gave a sense of spaciousness without overwhelming the visitor. The floor was laid with black and white marble tiles in a checkerboard pattern, each tile measuring precisely 12 inches square, imported from Italy at enormous expense. The black tiles were Belgian black marble, a dark limestone that polished to a deep, almost metallic sheen. The white tiles were Carrara marble from Tuscany, the same white stone that Michelangelo had used for his sculptures, with delicate grey veining that added visual interest, without compromising the overall effect of pure white. The walls were finished in expensive scagliola, a specialised technique using plaster and marble dust to imitate solid marble at a fraction of the cost, though still requiring master craftsmen to execute properly. Scagliola work involved applying multiple layers of specially formulated plaster, each layer tinted to match the colours found in natural marble, then polishing the surface to a glossy finish that looked and felt remarkably similar to real stone. The effect in Shepherd's Entrance Hall was to create the impression of walls sheathed in panels of coloured marble, cream, pale green and soft rose, divided by pilasters, that appeared to be white Carrara marble, but were actually scagliola. Only close inspection would reveal the truth, and few visitors would have been so impolite as to examine the walls that closely. The ceiling was the hall's crowning glory, a masterwork of decorative plasterwork that demonstrated both Shepherd's wealth and his taste. The plaster was modelled in high relief with classical motifs, swags of fruit and flowers hanging in graceful curves, medallions containing classical scenes rendered in delicate detail, geometric patterns based on ancient Roman models, and an elaborate central rosette from which hung an enormous chandelier. This chandelier was itself a work of art, constructed of brass and crystal, with 3 tiers of candle branches holding a total of 36 candles. When fully lit for evening entertainment, these candles would create a brilliant illumination, their light multiplied by the crystal pendants that caught and refracted each flame into rainbow sparkles. The plasterwork was picked out in subtle gilt, not the heavy, obvious gilding of Baroque palaces, but delicate touches of gold leaf applied to the highest points of the relief, so that candlelight would catch these surfaces and make them glow. The overall effect was one of refined opulence, not the overwhelming splendour of continental palaces, but the more restrained classical elegance that Georgian taste demanded. A cantilevered stone staircase rose in a graceful curve from the right side of the entrance hall to the first floor, its construction a marvel of engineering and craftsmanship. Cantilevered stairs that appear to float without visible support, each tread projecting from the wall and seeming to hang in space, were among the most technically challenging elements of Georgian architecture. Each tread was a single piece of stone, in this case limestone, shaped and polished, extending from the wall approximately 4 feet. The treads were actually built into the wall structure as the house was constructed, each one keyed into the masonry with iron reinforcements and with the weight of the masonry above holding everything in place. The visual effect was magical, a staircase that spiraled upward in defiance of gravity, elegant and apparently effortless. The balustrade was equally impressive, featuring delicate ironwork forged and shaped by a master blacksmith from Bristol. The iron was worked into scrolling patterns based on classical acanthus leaves, with gilded details picked out on the most prominent elements. A mahogany handrail, smoothly polished and perfect for the hand to grasp, topped the ironwork, providing both practical support and a visual horizontal line that complemented the curve of the stairs themselves. To the left of the entrance hall, a tall doorway with an elaborate carved surround led to the library, the room that would have been Edward Shepherd's sanctum, his private domain for business and contemplation. The library was designed as a masculine space, a room where a gentleman could retreat from the social whirl of the rest of the house to think, to read, to manage his affairs, or simply to enjoy a glass of port in solitude. The room measured approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, with a ceiling height of 12 feet, creating proportions that were comfortable and intimate compared to the more public spaces. 3 walls were covered floor to ceiling with bookcases in Cuban mahogany, that reddish-brown tropical hardwood that was considered the finest furniture timber available in the Georgian period. These bookcases were not simple shelves but architectural compositions, with fluted pilasters dividing the shelves into bays, with carved pediments topping each section, with adjustable shelves that could accommodate books of different sizes, from small duodecimos to large folios. Behind glazed doors, glass was used to protect valuable books from dust while allowing their spines to be displayed. The shelves held Shepherd's library. This library was substantial and reflected both Shepherd's practical business needs and his intellectual pretensions. Legal texts occupied several shelves. Blackstone's commentaries, which had revolutionized English legal scholarship when published in the 1760s, treatises on maritime law essential for anyone involved in shipping, and volumes on property law and inheritance. Books on commerce and trade filled more shelves, works on accounting and bookkeeping, price currents from London and Bristol listing commodity prices, treatises on currencies, and exchange rates essential for international trade. Navigation and geography were well represented, atlases showing the known world in ever-increasing detail, sailing directions for various coasts and harbours, tide tables and books on practical navigation, including how to use a sextant to determine latitude and how to calculate longitude using lunar distances or chronometer readings. Natural philosophy and science had their place too. Newton's Principia, the foundation of physics, volumes of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, works on botany and natural history. And of course there were the classics that any educated gentleman was expected to know: Homer and Virgil in Latin and in English translation, Horace and Ovid, Shakespeare and Milton, volumes of sermons and theological works that testified to the owner's piety. The fourth wall of the library featured 3 tall sash windows overlooking the south gardens, providing natural light ideal for reading and close work. During the day, sunlight would stream into the room, allowing Shepherd to work at his desk without need for candlelight. The windows were dressed with heavy curtains in dark green wool, which could be drawn to provide privacy or to reduce glare on particularly bright days. A massive partner's desk dominated the room, positioned to take advantage of the window light, while not being directly in front of the windows where anyone outside could see in. This desk was another piece of fine mahogany craftsmanship, measuring perhaps 8 feet by 5 feet, with a leather top providing a smooth writing surface and with multiple drawers on both sides, allowing 2 people to sit facing each other, hence partner's desk, originally designed for business partners to work simultaneously. The drawers were fitted with locks, essential for securing important papers and the cash that a gentleman might keep on hand for daily expenses. The desktop would have been covered with the tools of business: account ledgers bound in leather, a standish holding ink pots and quills, sealing wax and a personal seal for authenticating documents, letter paper and blotting sand, and always a heap of correspondence requiring attention. 2 leather armchairs, their surfaces worn smooth by use and age, sat before the fireplace on the east wall, a piece of statuary marble carved with classical motifs and fitted with a cast-iron grate for burning coal. This was where Shepherd might sit in the evenings, port at his elbow, warming himself while reading or simply staring into the flames and contemplating his empire of trade and the fortune he had built. The overall atmosphere of the library was one of solid comfort, masculine authority, and quiet wealth, a room that announced its owner as a man of substance, learning, and power. To the right of the entrance hall lay the drawing room, the principal reception space, where Shepherd would have entertained guests, hosted afternoon teas and evening socials, displayed his wealth and taste to visitors, and participated in the elaborate rituals of Georgian social life. This was where the house's elegance reached its highest expression, where no expense had been spared to create a space that would impress even the most sophisticated visitors. The drawing room ran the full depth of the house from front to back, measuring approximately 40 feet in length and 25 feet in width, with a ceiling height of 14 feet, creating a volume that felt spacious and grand without being overwhelming. Windows on both the south wall, facing the formal gardens, and the north wall, overlooking the park, created a through view that brought the landscape into the room while flooding the interior with natural light from 2 directions. This bilateral lighting was considered highly desirable in Georgian design, eliminating the harsh shadows that single-aspect rooms could produce and allowing the room to be bright and welcoming throughout the day. The ceiling was a masterwork of Rococo plasterwork, the most elaborate in the house. Despite the Palladian exterior and the generally classical restraint of most of the interior, Shepherd had allowed his plasterers to indulge in the more exuberant French-influenced Rococo style for this ceiling, creating a surface covered in high-relief decoration of extraordinary delicacy and complexity. The scheme centered on a large oval panel in the middle of the ceiling, framed by swags of flowers and fruit so finely modelled that individual petals and leaves were visible, with ribbons appearing to flutter in an invisible breeze. Within this oval was a painted scene. Shepherd had brought an Italian decorative painter from London to execute a classical subject, possibly Apollo and the Muses, or some other mythological theme appropriate to a cultivated gentleman's drawing room. Surrounding this central panel, the ceiling was divided into geometric compartments by ribs and borders of plasterwork, each compartment containing its own decorative element, medallions with classical profiles, trophies of musical instruments, more swags and garlands, all picked out in white plaster with touches of pale blue and gilt that caught the light and added sparkle. The walls were hung with hand-painted Chinese wallpaper, an enormously expensive luxury that was at the height of fashion in the 1770s. This wallpaper was not printed, but hand-painted, on sheets of paper in China, usually depicting exotic birds, flowering trees, and scenes of Chinese life in brilliant colours. Reds, blues, greens and golds that had not faded despite 2.5 centuries. Each sheet, or length of wallpaper, was a unique artwork, painted by skilled artisans in workshops in Canton or elsewhere in southern China. The paper was shipped carefully rolled in the holds of East India Company vessels on voyages that could take 6 months or more, travelling around the Cape of Good Hope and through dangerous seas where storms, pirates or simple bad luck could destroy the cargo. Once in England, the wallpaper had to be installed by specialists who knew how to handle the delicate paper, how to match the scenes from one sheet to the next, how to apply the adhesive without damaging the painted surface. The overall effect was to transform the walls into a fantasy landscape, a window into an exotic world that few people in Georgian England would ever see in reality. The fireplace was positioned on the west wall, a composition of statuary marble with an elaborately carved overmantel. The surround itself was white Carrara marble, polished to a smooth finish and carved with classical mouldings and details. The overmantel was more elaborate, featuring carved caryatids, female figures serving as columns, supporting the structure above, their robes appearing to flutter and their faces serene with classical beauty. Between the caryatids was a large panel designed to hold a painting, and here Shepherd had placed a portrait of himself, painted by Pompeo Battoni during a grand tour to Italy in 1769. This portrait was a statement piece, and like everything else in the room, it had been carefully chosen to send a message. Battoni was one of the most fashionable portrait painters in Europe, patronised by British aristocrats on their grand tours, who wanted flattering likenesses that showed them as cultured gentlemen rather than mere tourists. Battoni specialised in portraying his subjects in the guise of classical figures, dressed in togas or other classical garments, posed against backgrounds of Roman ruins or classical architecture. Shepherd's portrait showed him in exactly this style, draped in toga-like robes of white and crimson, one hand resting on a classical urn, the ruins of the Roman Forum visible in the background, his expression one of confident authority. The message was clear. Edward Shepherd saw himself as a modern heir to ancient Roman greatness, a man whose commercial achievements paralleled the empire-building of antiquity. That this comparison was deeply ironic. The Roman Empire had indeed been built on slavery, just as Shepherd's fortune had been, would not have troubled him in the slightest. Furniture in the drawing room was all of the highest quality. Seating included multiple sofas and chairs upholstered in silk damask in complementary colours to the wallpaper, pale blues and greens that wouldn't compete with the busy wallpaper pattern, but would harmonise with it. Side tables and card tables in mahogany and satinwood provided surfaces for tea services, books, needlework or card games. A pianoforte, one of the newly fashionable instruments that was replacing the harpsichord in elite homes, sat in one corner, its case decorated with marquetry and gilt metal mounts. Porcelain vases from China and Japan, famel rose plates mounted on the walls, and other oriental ceramics added to the exotic atmosphere and demonstrated Shepherd's access to luxury goods from around the world. The dining room was accessible through a concealed door in the wall, panelling from the drawing room, allowing hosts and guests to move from pre-dinner drinks in the drawing room to dinner without having to traverse the entrance hall, maintaining the privacy and flow of entertainment. This dining room was designed for the elaborate multi-course dinners that were essential to Georgian social life and that could last for hours as course followed course and wine followed wine. The room measured approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, with the long dimension running perpendicular to the drawing room. The ceiling height matched the drawing room at 14 feet, maintaining consistency across the principal reception spaces. The table, when fully extended with all its leaves inserted, measured nearly 30 feet in length, dominating the room and capable of seating 24 guests, 12 on each side. This massive table was made of mahogany planks from a single enormous tree, probably from Jamaica where the finest mahogany grew, with the grain carefully matched from one end to the other. The surface was so smooth and highly polished that it reflected the candlelight like a mirror, creating a sense of depth and luxury. When not in use for large dinners, the table could be contracted by removing the leaves, making the room suitable for family meals. The ceiling was elaborately plastered in a more restrained neoclassical style than the rococo exuberance of the drawing room, geometric coffers with rosettes at their centres, creating a sense of order and proportion appropriate to the civilized ritual of dining. The coffers were square, arranged in a grid pattern, each containing a rosette carved in high relief. The overall effect was one of classical harmony, a ceiling design that Vitruvius or Palladio would have approved. The walls were painted in a deep crimson using the most expensive pigments available. Cochineal red derived from insects imported from Mexico, mixed with other compounds to create a rich, warm colour that wouldn't fade in candlelight or sunlight. This colour choice was deliberate. Crimson was considered the ideal colour for dining rooms because it complemented the mahogany furniture, because it created a warm and convivial atmosphere, and because in candlelight it took on even richer tones, glowing like wine itself. The effect when the room was lit for dinner by dozens of candles, in wall sconces, in candelabra on the table, in the chandelier overhead, was magical, the red walls seeming to pulse with warmth and life. A massive sideboard dominated the east wall, a piece of furniture that was both practical and decorative. This sideboard, another example of fine mahogany work, stretched perhaps 12 feet in length, with a surface providing space for the display of silver and the staging of courses before service. The surface would have been covered with an array of silver serving pieces, tureens for soup, platters for roast meats, sauce boats, bread baskets, wine coolers and more, all polished to a brilliant shine. These pieces represented not just utility but wealth and status. Georgian dining silver was heavy, each piece containing significant quantities of actual silver, and a full dinner service could weigh hundreds of pounds and be worth thousands of pounds. The sideboard also contained cupboards and drawers for storing additional silver, linens and tableware when not in use. The windows on the south wall looked out over the gardens, allowing diners to enjoy views of the landscape while eating, though in the evenings when most formal dinners occurred, these windows would reflect candlelight rather than showing the darkened gardens beyond. Heavy curtains in crimson velvet, matching the wall colour, could be drawn to provide privacy and to reduce heat loss in winter, though they would typically remain open during dinners to maximise the sense of space. The first floor, accessed by that elegant cantilevered staircase, housed the principal bedchambers and private apartments. This was the family's private domain, less on display than the public rooms below, but still furnished and decorated to the same high standards. The main bedroom suite, reserved for Edward Shepherd and his wife Elizabeth, consisted of a bedroom, a dressing room, and a private sitting room, all interconnected by doors that could be closed for privacy, or left open to create a flowing suite of spaces. The bedroom was the largest and most important, measuring approximately 25 feet square with a ceiling height of 12 feet. The bed itself was a magnificent four-poster, the defining piece of furniture in any Georgian bedroom and a major expense. This bed featured 4 carved mahogany posts rising from the corners, each post elaborately turned and carved with classical motifs, acanthus leaves, egg and dart moulding, and fluted sections. From the tops of these posts hung elaborate fabric hangings, curtains that could be drawn closed on all 4 sides to create a private enclosed space within the room. These bed curtains served practical purposes. They blocked drafts, provided privacy, and created a cosy microclimate that made sleeping more comfortable in an age before central heating. but they were also status symbols, and the fabric used for shepherds' bed hangings was nothing less than silk damask from France, woven with elaborate patterns and dyed in rich colours, with gold bullion fringe adding weight and luxury to the edges. The dressing room, connected to the bedroom through a door on the west wall, was Edward Shepherd's private space for the daily ritual of dressing and grooming. This room was smaller, perhaps 12 feet square, but fitted out with built-in wardrobes in mahogany, each with glazed doors allowing Shepherd to see his clothing at a glance. A gentleman's wardrobe in the 1770s was extensive, multiple suits for different occasions and times of day, coats and breeches in various colours and fabrics, waistcoats plain and embroidered, shirts and cravats, stockings and shoes and boots. All of this had to be stored, maintained, and kept ready for use. A dressing table with a mirror allowed Shepherd to attend to his grooming, shaving, arranging his wig — wigs were still fashionable in the 1770s, though beginning to decline — and checking his appearance before facing the world. A comfortable chair and good lighting from a window overlooking the stable yard made this space functional as well as elegant. The sitting room, on the south side of the suite, provided a private retreat with views over the gardens. This was where Elizabeth Shepherd would have spent much of her time during the day, receiving close friends or family members for tea, reading, doing needlework, or attending to correspondence. The room was furnished more delicately than the masculine spaces of the house. Chairs and sofas upholstered in lighter fabrics, wallpaper in soft pastels, watercolours and miniature portraits on the walls rather than heavy oil paintings. A writing desk provided a place for managing household accounts and writing the letters that were an essential part of a gentlewoman's social life. Everything in this room spoke to comfort and gentility, a private haven away from the formality of the public spaces. Additional bedrooms, each with its own fireplace and carefully chosen furnishings, occupied the rest of the first floor. Guest bedrooms for important visitors, a nursery for the children Shepherd hoped to have, perhaps a room for a lady's companion or a governess. All were fitted out with appropriate furniture and decoration. None matched the luxury of the master suite, but all were comfortable and well appointed by the standards of the age. This floor also contained small closets and storage spaces, some of which concealed doorways to the servants' stairs that allowed maids and footmen to move through the house without being seen by the family and guests, one of the defining features of Georgian house design. The second floor, the attic level, was entirely given over to servants' quarters, storage, and service spaces. Here the grandeur of the floors below gave way to stark functionality: simple whitewashed walls, plain floorboards, basic furniture consisting of narrow beds and simple storage chests. This was where the army of servants required to run a house like Gatcombe lived their lives, sleeping in small rooms that might hold 2 or 3 people, rising before dawn to light fires and prepare the house for the day, and retiring after the family had gone to bed. Despite the simplicity, these rooms were probably better than the accommodations most servants would have had in other employment, and service in a well-run house like Gatcombe offered security, regular meals, and the prestige of working for a wealthy family. But it was the basement and the spaces below that made Gatcombe truly unusual, and that have been the source of secrecy and concealment ever since. The main basement level, at least as visitors would have understood it, contained the usual offices of a Georgian household, the working heart of the estate that allowed everything above to function smoothly. The kitchen occupied a large space on the north side of the house, positioned there so that cooking smells and heat would not drift into the main living areas. This was a room designed for serious food production, fitted with enormous ranges fired by coal or wood, with brick ovens for baking bread and pastries, with work tables for preparation, with copper pots and pans hanging from racks on the walls. A scullery adjacent to the kitchen provided space for washing dishes and pots, with stone sinks and draining boards. A larder with thick stone walls provided cool storage for meat, dairy, and other perishables. A dry goods storeroom held flour, sugar, spices, and other ingredients. The kitchen would have been staffed by a cook and several kitchen maids, all working under intense heat and pressure to produce the elaborate meals that Georgian dining required. The servants' hall, where the household staff took their meals and spent their limited free time, was another large space, fitted with long tables and benches. This was governed by its own strict hierarchy. Upper servants, like the butler and housekeeper, would sit at the head of the table and be served first and best, while lower servants like scullery maids and stable boys would sit further down and receive simpler fare. Wine cellars occupied a substantial portion of the basement, as one would expect for a house of this scale. These cellars were carefully designed to maintain optimal conditions for wine storage. Cool, but not cold temperatures, moderate humidity, minimal vibration, and complete darkness when not in use. Racks of oak or iron held thousands of bottles, organized by type and vintage, each bottle lying on its side to keep the cork moist and prevent oxidation. A tasting area with a table and chairs allowed shepherd or his butler to sample wines and assess their development. All of this was entirely conventional. Any great house of the period would have had similar facilities. But beyond these conventional basement spaces lay the entrances to the deeper levels, the network of tunnels and chambers that made Gatcombe unique and sinister. Access to these deeper cellars was controlled by Edward Shepherd himself. He held the only keys to the iron-bound doors that led downward. Even his most trusted servants were forbidden entry to these spaces, on pain of immediate dismissal or worse. The butler might know where the keys were kept, might even know that there were sealed spaces beneath the house, but he would not have dared to explore them without explicit permission. What we know of these spaces comes from multiple sources, none of them complete but together forming a disturbing picture. Estate records that survived, though many were destroyed or went missing over the centuries, contain references to underground storage, secure chambers, and special works below the foundations. Account books show payments for night work and discreet labour, suggesting work done under cover of darkness by workers who were paid to keep silent. There are receipts for iron doors, heavy locks, chains, and other hardware that seems excessive for simple wine storage. And there are the gaps, periods of weeks or months where the usually meticulous accounting simply stops, as though Shepherd wanted no documentary trail of what was occurring. Modern investigation has added to this picture. The ground-penetrating radar survey conducted in the 1990s revealed the extraordinary extent of the tunnel network, nearly 3 acres of underground space on multiple levels. Archaeological work in 2003, ostensibly for drainage but revealing the chamber with manacles, provided physical evidence of the tunnel's darker purposes. And there have been other discoveries over the years, most hushed up or minimised, that together suggest what Gatcombe's underground complex really was. The main lower cellar, directly beneath the main basement, was indeed used for wine storage on a scale far exceeding what the conventional cellars could accommodate. Temperature and humidity here were naturally regulated by being deep underground, with thick stone walls and minimal air circulation, creating ideal conditions for long-term storage. This cellar probably held tens of thousands of bottles, not just wine for current consumption, but vintages laid down to age for decades, investments in liquid form that would appreciate in value as they matured. For a wealthy man like Shepherd, wine was not just a beverage but an asset class, and cellars like this were essentially bank vaults for luxury goods. But the branching tunnels served other purposes that Shepherd went to great lengths to conceal. One tunnel, running eastward toward the boundary of the property, appears to have been designed as both a storage space and an escape route. Modern investigation suggests this tunnel extends nearly 200 feet from the house, maintaining a slight upward gradient throughout to ensure water drainage, with air shafts at intervals to provide ventilation and prevent the dangerous build-up of gases that can occur in underground spaces. The tunnel is approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough for an adult to walk through comfortably, but not so large as to require excessive excavation. The walls are lined with brick, the floor paved with stone flags, and the ceiling arched for structural strength. Alcoves cut into the walls at intervals suggest spaces for storage, secured trunks, chests, containers of various kinds, and there are traces of what might have been shelving or racks now long rotted away. This tunnel emerges, or at least emerged before being sealed, in a copse of trees near the eastern edge of the park, the exit concealed by an arrangement of stones that would appear natural to casual observation, but that could be moved aside from within. This kind of concealed exit strongly suggests an escape route, a bolt hole that could be used if the main house became untenable for any reason. and there were many reasons why a wealthy man in the late 18th century might want such a contingency plan. Political unrest could make even remote country estates unsafe. The Gordon riots of 1780 showed how quickly mobs could form and how much destruction they could cause. Criminal gangs sometimes targeted wealthy homes, knowing that isolation made them vulnerable, and that country houses contained portable wealth in the form of silver, jewellery and cash. And for a man like Shepherd, whose wealth came from morally questionable sources, there was always the possibility of legal action, asset seizure, or worse. An escape tunnel that would allow him to flee with portable assets could mean the difference between maintaining his fortune and losing everything. Another tunnel descends from the main cellar level in a spiral, like the inverse of the grand staircase above, but carved through solid rock rather than floating elegantly in space. This spiral staircase, as revealed by modern ground-penetrating radar and the limited exploration that has been conducted, descends at least 2 levels below the main cellar, possibly 3. Each complete spiral drops approximately 10 feet vertically, with the steps cut directly into the limestone bedrock and then fitted with stone treads for safer footing. The centre of the spiral forms a shaft perhaps 8 feet in diameter, and while architectural historians initially assumed this was simply for structural reasons or ventilation, recent analysis suggests it might have served another purpose: a shaft down which heavy items could be lowered on ropes, allowing bulky or heavy cargo to be taken to the deepest levels without the difficulty of carrying it down the narrow spiral stairs. At the bottom of this spiral, at least 50 feet below ground level, lies a complex of chambers whose full extent and purpose may never be known unless they are excavated and thoroughly investigated, something that seems increasingly unlikely as the royal household maintains its policy of secrecy and non-disclosure. What we know from fragmentary evidence suggests these deep chambers were the true heart of Gatcombe's underground complex, the spaces where Edward Shepherd's darkest secrets were kept. One of these chambers, according to the archaeologists who entered it briefly in 2003, was approximately 20 feet square with an 8-foot ceiling, dimensions that would have required enormous effort to excavate from solid limestone. The walls had been carefully finished, not left as rough rock, but plastered and whitewashed, creating a space that was meant to be inhabited by people rather than used only for storage. But the features of this chamber told a story very different from comfortable habitation. Iron rings were set into the walls at roughly 6-foot intervals, positioned at a height perfect for securing chains that would restrain standing or sitting human beings. The manacles found attached to some of these chains were crude, even by 18th century standards, heavy iron shackles with simple locks, designed to prevent escape rather than minimize discomfort. These were not decorative restraints or the kind of irons used for short-term detention of criminals awaiting transport to magistrates. These were serious instruments of long-term imprisonment. The evidence of habitation was equally disturbing. The remains of straw mattresses suggested people had slept in this chamber, lying directly on the stone floor or on minimal bedding. Wooden buckets, rotted but still identifiable, had served as chamber pots, basic sanitation that would have done little to make the space tolerable. And then there were the marks on the walls, scratches made with something sharp enough to score the plaster and even the limestone beneath. Some of these marks appear to be tally marks, groups of 5 lines with a 6th crossing them, the universal system prisoners use to count days when they have no other way to track time's passage. Other marks are less clear, scratches that might be attempts at writing, or simply the random marking of desperate people with nothing else to do. Who was held in this chamber? How many people? For how long? And what happened to them? These questions may never be answered. The chamber was sealed within days of its discovery, filled with concrete and closed off from the rest of the tunnel system. The order came from the highest levels. The royal household was explicit that no further investigation was to be conducted, that all findings were to be classified, that anyone who spoke publicly about what had been found would face legal consequences. But we can make educated guesses based on historical context and the fragmentary evidence that has emerged over the years. One possibility already mentioned is that Edward Shepherd was holding enslaved people in these chambers. The timeline works. Shepherd was most active in the slave trade from the 1740s through the 1770s, exactly the period when Gatcombe was being built and when the chambers would have been constructed. The legal situation in England was ambiguous enough that holding people in private imprisonment might have seemed feasible, and Shepherd would have had both motive and means. Enslaved people were valuable property that he might want to secure against escape, or that he might want to punish without the public spectacle that legal punishment would entail. Another possibility concerns the medical experimentation that was increasingly common in the 18th century. This was the age when anatomy was becoming a serious science, when physicians and surgeons were eager to understand human physiology through dissection and experimentation. But access to cadavers and living subjects was severely limited by law and social custom. Criminals executed for serious offences could be dissected, and some physicians paid body snatchers to rob graves for fresh corpses. But these sources were insufficient for the demands of medical research. Some doctors, particularly those involved in colonial medicine, who were trying to understand diseases affecting enslaved people on plantations, experimented on living enslaved people, justifying this horror with the racist pseudoscience of the era that claimed black people were fundamentally different from and inferior to white people. Could the chambers beneath Gatcombe have been used for such experimentation? The evidence is circumstantial but disturbing. Shepherd was known to correspond with physicians interested in tropical diseases. His ships brought back not just cargo but crew members and enslaved people affected by various illnesses, and he had both the opportunity and the moral flexibility to permit such experimentation if it seemed profitable or useful. A third possibility relates to Shepherd's business operations and the violent world of 18th century commerce. The slave trade was competitive and brutal, with traders willing to use violence, intimidation and murder to protect their interests and eliminate rivals. Ships' captains sometimes embezzled cargo or betrayed their owners. Business partners cheated each other. Competitors spread damaging rumours or sabotaged each other's ventures. In this environment, having a place to hold people securely and secretly could be very useful, a place to interrogate captains suspected of embezzlement, to detain business rivals during sensitive negotiations, to hold hostages to ensure compliance with agreements. The manacles and confined space of the underground chamber would have been very effective for such purposes. We will probably never know the full truth, and perhaps that's deliberate. The British establishment, from the royal family down through the aristocracy and into the institutions of government, has shown little interest in fully confronting the legacy of slavery and colonial exploitation. Museums have begun to acknowledge it, universities have commissioned studies, cities have removed statues of slave traders. But when it comes to physical evidence, actual spaces where actual horrors occurred, there seems to be a strong impulse to keep it buried, literally and figuratively. Gatcombe Park represents that impulse perfectly. Rather than excavating the chambers, investigating thoroughly, documenting everything, and presenting the findings honestly to the public, the royal household has chosen secrecy, concealment, and silence. Edward Shepherd lived at Gatcombe Park for 32 years, from its completion in 1774 until his death in 1806 at the age of 86, a remarkably long life for the 18th century. During those 3 decades, he transformed himself from merchant prince to country gentleman, from nouveau riche trader to respected member of the landed gentry. He served as a justice of the peace, dispensing justice and maintaining order in the local community. He contributed generously to local charities, funding the rebuilding of the parish church, donating to schools and almshouses, supporting agricultural improvement societies. He was known as a generous host, holding shooting parties for neighbouring gentry, hosting dinners for local worthies, maintaining the kind of open-handed hospitality that the English upper classes expected from great landowners. By all appearances, he was exactly what he seemed, a successful businessman who had earned an honourable retirement in elegant surroundings. But this respectability required constant maintenance and careful management of his reputation. Shepherd gradually distanced himself from active involvement in the slave trade, selling his ships one by one during the 1780s and 1790s as the abolitionist movement gained strength and as public opinion began to turn against the trade. He transitioned his wealth into land ownership, purchasing additional farms and estates in Gloucestershire and Somerset until he controlled over 2,000 acres. He invested in government bonds, in emerging manufacturing enterprises, in canals and turnpike trusts and other infrastructure projects that were transforming Britain into the first industrial nation. By the time of his death, his wealth had been thoroughly laundered, its origins in slavery obscured beneath layers of respectable investment and agricultural income. But Shepherd never forgot where his fortune came from, and he never stopped protecting the secrets buried beneath Gatcombe. Estate records show that throughout his time at Gatcombe, he maintained the underground complex, paying for repairs to doors and locks, ensuring that certain chambers remained sealed, and providing funds for discreet maintenance whose nature was never specified. He also worked to ensure that the tunnels would remain secret after his death. When Shepherd's will was read in January 1807, it contained several unusual provisions that suggested he was deeply concerned about what might happen to Gatcombe and its secrets after he was gone. The bulk of the estate, valued at over £150,000, went to his eldest son Richard, along with specific instructions about managing the property. But then came a remarkable bequest. £10,000, an enormous sum equal to what many country estates generated in rental income over a decade, was left to establish a trust whose purpose was described only as the maintenance and preservation of certain structures on the Gatcombe estate in perpetuity, without alteration or public access. This trust remarkably still exists today, now managed by a law firm in Bristol that handles the administrative details while taking instructions from trustees whose identities are not public. The trust's accounts are not published, its activities are not disclosed, and its very existence is known only to specialists in estate law and to those with access to the sealed sections of Shepherd's will held in the Gloucestershire archives. The will also contained explicit instructions, written in Shepherd's own hand rather than by his solicitor, that certain chambers beneath the house were to be sealed with brick and mortar within 30 days of his death, that the keys to these chambers were to be destroyed, and that the sealed areas were never to be opened or disturbed for any reason whatsoever. These instructions were carried out in February 1807, supervised by Shepherd's eldest son and by the family solicitor. Workers brought in from Bristol, men who had no connection to the local area, and who were paid generous bonuses for their silence, filled several chambers with rubble, and then bricked up the entrances so thoroughly that the sealed spaces disappeared from the accessible parts of the underground network. What was in those chambers before they were sealed? What evidence of Shepherd's activities was considered so damaging that it had to be buried forever? We will never know unless those seals are broken and the chambers are excavated, something that seems increasingly unlikely with each passing year. Edward Shepherd was buried in the parish church at Minchinhampton, with all the honours due to a wealthy and respected gentleman. His monument, which still stands in the church, describes him as a merchant of Bristol who through industry and judicious commerce acquired a considerable fortune, which he employed in the improvement of this parish and in works of charity and public benefit. There is no mention of the slave trade, no acknowledgement of where his fortune really came from, no hint of what might lie beneath the elegant house he built with those blood-stained profits. His funeral was attended by hundreds, family, friends, business associates, local gentry, tenants from his estates, and workers from his farms. The eulogies praised his generosity, his wisdom, his contributions to the local community. Within a generation, the specific details of his commercial career had faded from local memory, leaving only a vague sense that he had been in trade before becoming a landed gentleman. The Shepherd family retained Gatcombe Park for 3 more generations, though none of Edward's descendants achieved his wealth or prominence. His son Richard managed the estate competently, but lacked his father's business acumen and drive. Richard's son, Edward II, was an army officer who spent most of his life abroad in India, leaving the estate management to stewards. Edward II's son, Richard II, was a clergyman who inherited Gatcombe in the 1850s, but found its upkeep burdensome on a cleric's income, supplemented only by agricultural rents. By this time, the moral and political landscape had shifted dramatically. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807, the year after Edward Shepherd's death. Slavery throughout the British Empire had been abolished in 1833. The family fortune, built on slavery, now existed in a world where slavery was not just illegal, but morally condemned. The source of the shepherd's wealth became something shameful rather than celebrated, something to be forgotten or minimized rather than proudly proclaimed. Later, shepherds became army officers, clergymen, country squires and professional men, living off the agricultural income of the estate and the investments that Edward Shepherd's fortune had made possible, but distancing themselves from the origins of that fortune. They maintained Gatcombe Park, making updates and improvements as needed, and as funds allowed. The house was fitted with gas lighting in the 1840s, with running water and modern plumbing in the 1860s, with electricity in the 1890s. The park was maintained in the romantic landscape style that became fashionable in the Victorian era. The farms were run with increasing attention to scientific agriculture and improved breeding. But the family fortune was slowly depleting. Agricultural depressions in the 1870s and 1880s devastated the incomes of landed estates throughout Britain as cheap grain from America and Australia flooded the market. Death duties, introduced in the late 19th century and increased repeatedly thereafter, took enormous bites out of estates with each generation, forcing sales of land, timber and other assets just to pay the tax. By the 1890s, the Shepherd family was in serious financial difficulties. The last shepherd to own Gatcombe, Richard Shepherd, was facing bankruptcy by 1900. Agricultural income had collapsed, investments had performed poorly, and death duties from his father's death had consumed most of the liquid assets. The house needed expensive repairs, the roof was leaking, woodwork was rotting, and the ancient heating and plumbing systems needed complete replacement. Richard Shepherd had no choice but to sell, hoping to realise enough from the sale to pay his debts and provide something for his children's future. In 1901, Gatcombe Park was sold to the Butler family for £45,000, a price that reflected both the property's run-down condition and the depressed state of the agricultural land market. The Butlers were wealthy industrialists who had made their fortune in a very different trade from the Shepherds, coal mining in South Wales, where the valleys were being transformed by the demand for coal to fuel industry and to supply the Royal Navy's growing fleet of steam-powered warships. William Butler, the patriarch who purchased Gatcombe, was a self-made man like Edward Shepherd had been, rising from modest origins to great wealth through ruthless business practice and strategic investment. The Butlers were eager to acquire the social status that came with owning a Georgian country house and to establish themselves among the gentry of Gloucestershire, and Gatcombe offered exactly what they sought: a beautiful classical house with a distinguished history, extensive parkland and farms, and a location in one of England's most prestigious counties. The new owners undertook extensive renovations between 1902 and 1905, investing heavily to modernise the house while carefully preserving its Georgian character. They installed central heating using a new boiler system that circulated hot water through radiators throughout the house, replacing the inefficient and labour-intensive system of individual coal fires in each room. They updated the plumbing completely, adding modern bathrooms with running hot and cold water, flush toilets, and bathtubs. They rewired the electrical system, replacing the dangerous early wiring with modern standards and installing electric lights throughout. They repaired the roof, replacing damaged slates and repairing the underlying timbers. They restored the plasterwork, retouched the decorative painting, and generally brought the house back to its original glory while making it comfortable for 20th century living. But they too became aware of the secrets beneath their new home. Family papers held by Butler descendants and made available to researchers in recent years reveal that within months of moving in, during the renovation work, workers opened a door in the basement that they thought led to wine cellars and instead discovered the entrance to the deeper tunnel system. The family solicitor was consulted, and he in turn contacted the solicitors managing the Shepherd Trust. Documents were reviewed, and the Butlers learned enough of the history, probably not the full truth, but enough, to decide, like the Shepherds before them, that some things were better left buried. William Butler, in a letter to his son written in 1903, expressed his concerns with careful circumspection. We have discovered below the house certain spaces and structures whose purpose and history are unclear, but which appear connected to the original owner's commercial activities. I have been advised that investigation or discussion of these matters would serve no good purpose, and might indeed create difficulties for the family. We shall therefore maintain the seals that were placed upon these spaces by direction of the shepherds, and shall not speak of this matter outside the family. The letter suggests that the butlers knew something troubling about the underground complex, but chose not to investigate further, accepting the same policy of silence and concealment that the shepherds had established. The Butler family held Gatcombe through 2 world wars and the enormous social changes of the 20th century. During World War I, the house served briefly as a convalescent hospital for wounded officers, its elegant rooms filled with hospital beds and medical equipment, its beautiful parkland turned into grounds for rehabilitation and therapy. Men who had survived the horrors of the Western Front, the mud and blood of the Somme, the gas attacks at Ypres, the endless grinding attrition of trench warfare, recuperated in the Georgian splendour of Gatcombe, probably never knowing what lay beneath their feet. During World War II, portions of the estate were used for agricultural production as part of the Dig for Victory campaign that converted parkland throughout Britain into productive farmland to help feed a nation cut off from imported food by German submarine warfare. The house itself remained private, though the family contributed to the war effort in various ways, housing evacuees from London, hosting meetings of local defence organisations, and allowing the grounds to be used for training exercises by the Home Guard. The post-war period brought new challenges. Coal mining, the source of the Butler fortune, was nationalised in 1947, and while the Butlers received compensation for their expropriated mines, the loss of this income stream meant they had to rely increasingly on agricultural income from Gatcombe and on investments. Death duties remained punishingly high, at rates approaching 80% on large estates by the 1960s, and each generation saw more of the family wealth eroded. By the early 1970s, the Butlers were facing the same pressures that had forced the Shepherds to sell 7 decades earlier: insufficient income to maintain the property, huge tax bills with each generation, and no clear path to sustainability. It was at this point that Gatcombe Park came to royal attention. In the early 1970s, Princess Anne, only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, was searching for a country residence where she could live away from the formality and public scrutiny of London, where she could pursue her passion for horses and equestrian sports, and where she could raise a family in relative privacy. Anne had married Captain Mark Phillips in 1973, and the couple wanted a working estate where they could breed and train horses, preferably in the Cotswolds or similar countryside within reasonable distance of London. Gatcombe checked all the boxes. Its 730 acres included excellent grassland for pasture, existing stables that could be expanded, and beautiful landscapes ideal for cross-country riding. The house was large enough to accommodate family life and official entertaining, but not so massive as to require enormous staff. And the location in Gloucestershire was perfect, close to other royal residences including Highgrove House, which Charles would later acquire, within 2 hours of London for official duties, but rural enough to provide real privacy and seclusion. The purchase was completed in 1976 for £500,000, paid by Queen Elizabeth II as a gift for her daughter. Even at the time, this was recognised as a favourable price given the quality and size of the estate, reflecting the Butler family's eagerness to sell, and perhaps also some discount in recognition of the royal connection that would bring prestige even as the family lost the property. But before the sale could be finalised, the royal household conducted due diligence far more extensive than a normal house purchase would warrant. Security services from MI5 and the Metropolitan Police swept the entire property, checking for potential security vulnerabilities, planning protection measures, and examining every aspect of the estate. Surveyors examined every structure in minute detail. Historians researched the property's complete ownership history, and, inevitably, they discovered the tunnels. The official report of this pre-purchase investigation remains classified under the Official Secrets Act, but enough has leaked over the years to piece together the general outline. The security services brought in specialists in underground structures, including former military engineers and mining experts. They used ground-penetrating radar to map the full extent of the tunnel network. They examined the sealed entrances and considered whether to open them for complete investigation. And they found evidence, we don't know exactly what, but enough to raise serious concerns, that the tunnels had a dark history connected to the slave trade and Edward Shepherd's activities. A decision was made at the highest levels. The tunnels would not be fully investigated. The sealed chambers would remain sealed. The full history would not be researched or disclosed. Instead, Gatcombe Park would be maintained as a strictly private residence with no public access whatsoever. This decision may have come from the Queen herself, from senior government officials concerned about the political implications of royal ownership of a former slave trader's property, or from some combination of palace and government. Whoever made it, the decision has held for nearly 50 years. This is highly unusual among royal residences and reflects the special concerns that Gatcombe Park raises. Balmoral Castle in Scotland and Sandringham House in Norfolk, both private properties of the royal family rather than Crown estate properties, open their grounds to the public during certain months when the family is not in residence, generating income from tourism, while allowing the public to enjoy historically and architecturally significant properties. Windsor Castle, while an official residence, welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors annually when the state apartments are not in use for official functions. Buckingham Palace opened to summer tours in 1993 as a way to generate funds for Windsor Castle repairs after the fire. Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh has public tours year-round, except when the Queen, now King, is in official residence. Even Clarence House, the residence of the late Queen Mother and now King Charles, opens for tours during the summer months. But Gatcombe Park? Never. Not once in nearly 50 years of royal ownership has the public been admitted, even for charity events which royals frequently host at their homes, not for garden tours, not for historical society visits, not for heritage open days, not for any reason whatsoever. The official explanation has always been security concerns and the Princess Royal's desire for privacy. And certainly, security is a valid concern. Royal residences do face unique risks, and privacy is understandable. Princess Anne has always been one of the most private members of the royal family, eschewing publicity and preferring to let her work speak for itself. But many royal watchers, historians and journalists believe the real reason lies beneath the ground. The royal household decided that the dark history of the tunnels and whatever evidence of Edward Shepherd's crimes might still lurk in those sealed chambers was simply too dangerous to risk public exposure. To open Gatcombe to the public would inevitably lead to questions about its history, to researchers wanting access, to calls for the tunnels to be investigated. To sell the property would risk it passing to someone who might excavate the tunnels and expose their secrets, creating a scandal that would splash the royal family across the tabloids and create uncomfortable associations between the monarchy and slavery, at a time when Britain was trying to position itself as a champion of human rights and racial equality. The solution was to keep everything locked down, private, secret. The Princess Royal would live there quietly, maintaining the property beautifully, using it as a working equestrian estate, but never, ever allowing the public through the gates. The tunnels would remain sealed. The trust established by Edward Shepherd's will would continue its work of maintaining those seals. And anyone who discovered too much or asked too many questions would be warned off, either politely or, if necessary, with legal threats invoking official secrecy laws and anti-trespass statutes. Princess Anne has lived at Gatcombe Park since 1977, a tenure of nearly 50 years that has made it her true home, far more than any London palace or official residence. She raised her children there, Peter Phillips, born 1977, and Zara Tyndall, born 1981. Both grew up riding horses across those same Gloucestershire fields where enslaved people's labour had once generated the profits to build their home. Both children became accomplished equestrians, following their mother's passion and achieving international success in eventing and other equestrian disciplines. The estate has been maintained beautifully. The house has been updated with modern amenities while preserving its Georgian character: new kitchens and bathrooms, modern heating and electrical systems, computers and communications technology, but all done in ways that respect the historic fabric of the building. The gardens have been lovingly tended. The park has been managed as a model of sustainable land use. The farmland has been worked productively. Princess Anne hosts the annual Gatcombe Horse Trials, a major event in the equestrian calendar, though even this event is carefully controlled with public access, limited to specific areas far from the house itself. To all outward appearances, Gatcombe Park is simply an elegant country house, home to a hard-working member of the royal family known for her no-nonsense approach, her dedication to charitable causes, and her excellence in equestrian sports. Visitors to the horse trials see beautiful parkland, well-maintained facilities, and smooth organisation. They don't see the house itself, which remains hidden behind trees and security barriers. They certainly don't see the tunnels, but beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, the past remains, refusing to be completely forgotten or buried. The tunnel system still exists, though most of it is sealed and inaccessible. The chambers that once held, we can only guess, enslaved people, prisoners or others, Edward Shepherd wanted to conceal, remain beneath the beautiful lawns and gardens, and periodically, the past intrudes into the present in ways that cannot be entirely suppressed or controlled. In 2011, during excavations for a new drainage system required, because climate change was creating more intense rainfall events that the Victorian-era drainage couldn't handle, workers uncovered human remains in an area near one of the tunnel entrances, about 50 yards from the house's northeast corner. The discovery triggered immediate security protocols that had apparently been developed specifically for this eventuality. The site was sealed within hours. The workers were isolated, their phones confiscated, and they were required to sign non-disclosure agreements before being released. A discreet archaeological investigation was conducted by a team from a university that had existing contracts with the royal household, working under security clearance, and with all findings classified. The official statement released to the press was minimal. During routine drainage work at Gatcombe Park, some historic remains were discovered. The remains have been examined by experts and determined to be of considerable age. They have been respectfully reinterred in accordance with appropriate protocols. The statement gave no details about the age of the remains, their number, their identity, or the circumstances of their discovery and reinterment. But information leaked, as it always does when too many people know a secret. The archaeologists who worked on the excavation, bound by non-disclosure agreements and official secrets laws, nonetheless spoke to family members and close friends. And decades later, as they neared the end of their careers and became less concerned about professional consequences, some spoke more openly to journalists and researchers, though always off the record and without allowing their names to be used. What they described was disturbing. The remains were of at least 4 individuals, all young adults, buried without coffins in a shallow mass grave. The bones showed signs of malnutrition and stress, suggesting lives of hardship. DNA analysis, conducted in secret, revealed they were of Sub-Saharan African origin, not European, not Asian, but African. Radiocarbon dating placed their deaths in the late 18th century, most likely between 1770 and 1800. They had been buried without ceremony, without markers, without any indication of who they were or how they died. Just 4 human beings, reduced to anonymous bones in the dirt, their lives and deaths deemed unimportant enough that they could be buried like garbage near the house of the man who probably owned them. The archaeologists wanted to do more, to conduct fuller analysis, to attempt to determine causes of death, to see if historical records could identify who these people might have been. But they were forbidden. The remains were quickly reinterred in a local churchyard, in an unmarked grave with no ceremony, no memorial, no acknowledgement of who they were or what had happened to them. The excavation site was filled with concrete and covered with topsoil. The new drainage system was routed around the area to prevent any future disturbance, and the workers and archaeologists were reminded of their legal obligations to remain silent. What happened to these people? Were they enslaved Africans who died on shepherds' ships or plantations and were brought to Gatcombe for burial? Were they people who were held in the tunnels and died there, either from the conditions of confinement or from some more violent cause? Were they subjects of medical experiments, victims of 18th century anatomists who saw enslaved people as convenient subjects for their research? We will never know unless the full tunnel system is excavated and a comprehensive archaeological investigation conducted, and there is no sign whatsoever that such an investigation will be permitted in the foreseeable future. The discovery of human remains raised profound moral questions that the royal household showed no interest in addressing. What responsibility does the current owner of a property bear for crimes that might have been committed there centuries ago by previous owners? Does the British public have a right to know what evidence of historical atrocities might exist on property that, while privately owned, is occupied by a family that holds its position through public support and taxpayer funding? Should historians and archaeologists be granted access to investigate sites that might contain important evidence about Britain's involvement in slavery and the slave trade, even if those sites are on private property? Should the families and communities of enslaved people have some say in what happens to remains that might be those of their ancestors? These questions are particularly acute in the case of Gatcombe Park because of the royal connection. If this were simply a private country house owned by a private family, the owners could reasonably claim absolute property rights and refuse access to anyone. But the royal family is not a normal private family. They hold their position through constitutional arrangements that depend on public support. They receive substantial public funding through the sovereign grant. Their security is provided at taxpayer expense. They occupy a unique place in British society as symbols of national identity and continuity. With these privileges come responsibilities, including, many would argue, a responsibility to be open about history, even uncomfortable history, and to allow historical sites and artifacts to be studied and preserved for public benefit. Moreover, the context of contemporary Britain makes the secrecy around Gatcombe Park particularly problematic. Britain has, in recent decades, begun to confront the darker aspects of its imperial past with greater honesty than previous generations managed. Museums like the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and numerous regional museums have begun to acknowledge that many of their finest collections were acquired through theft, looting, and colonial exploitation. They have started to research and disclose the provenances of contested objects and to consider repatriation claims from source countries and communities. Universities like Oxford and Cambridge have commissioned extensive studies into their historical connections to slavery, discovering that numerous colleges were endowed with fortunes built on slave trade profits, and that architectural details in their buildings include visual references to slavery and empire. The Church of England has apologised for its historical involvement in slavery and has committed to researching and acknowledging the extent of that involvement. Cities like Bristol and Liverpool, which grew wealthy on the slave trade, have begun to grapple with this legacy in public ways. Bristol famously saw the statue of slave trader Edward Colston toppled by protesters in 2020 and thrown into the harbour, an act that sparked intense national debate about how Britain should remember and represent its imperial past. Liverpool has opened the International Slavery Museum, which documents both the horrors of the slave trade and the resistance to it. London has added plaques and markers to sites associated with the slave trade, ensuring that this history is visible in the landscape rather than hidden. But Gatcombe Park remains locked down, silent, sealed. The royal household has shown no interest in participating in this broader national reckoning with slavery and empire. They have commissioned no research into the property's history. They have invited no historians or archaeologists to investigate. They have shared no documents or artifacts that might illuminate what happened there. They have made no acknowledgement of the property's dark past, and no gesture of respect or remembrance for the people who may have suffered and died there. This stance is becoming increasingly untenable as public awareness of Britain's slave trade history grows, and as activists, historians, and community groups push for greater transparency and acknowledgement. In 2020, during the global reckoning with racism sparked by the Black Lives Matter movement and the murder of George Floyd in the United States, a group of historians, activists, and concerned citizens petitioned the royal household to allow an independent investigation of Gatcombe Park's tunnels and their history. The petition was carefully crafted, moderate in tone, and explicit in its requests. It called for permission for qualified archaeologists and historians to survey the tunnel system using non-invasive techniques like ground-penetrating radar and laser scanning, opening of sealed chambers for careful archaeological excavation and documentation, DNA analysis of any human remains discovered to attempt to determine origins and identities, full disclosure of all findings to the public through published reports and public displays, appropriate memorialization of any victims whose evidence is discovered, public acknowledgement of the property's connection to slavery and Edward Shepherd's role in the slave trade. The petition gathered over 50,000 signatures within weeks, demonstrating substantial public interest in the issue. It was covered by several major newspapers, which ran investigative pieces about Gatcombe Park's history and the ongoing secrecy surrounding the tunnels. The Guardian published a long feature article tracing Edward Shepherd's career in the slave trade and raising questions about what might lie beneath the estate. The Times ran an editorial arguing that historical sites like Gatcombe should be open to scholarly investigation regardless of current ownership. Even the tabloids got involved, with the Daily Mail running sensationalist headlines about secrets in the royal cellars and what is the princess hiding. The response from Buckingham Palace and the Princess Royal's office was swift, coordinated, and absolutely final. A carefully worded statement was released. Gatcombe Park is the private residence of Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal. As with any private home, matters relating to its maintenance, security, and day-to-day operations are private. The royal household is committed to understanding and acknowledging difficult aspects of history where appropriate, and continues to support the important work being done by museums, universities, and other institutions to research and present Britain's complex past. However, the Princess Royal's private home is not an appropriate venue for such investigations, and the security and privacy concerns inherent in opening a royal residence to ongoing archaeological work make such an undertaking impractical. The statement was a masterpiece of polite stonewalling. It acknowledged the importance of historical research in general terms, while firmly refusing to allow any at Gatcombe specifically. It cited security and privacy, always the go-to justifications for royal secrecy, without engaging with the substantive historical and moral questions at stake. And most significantly, it made clear that no amount of public pressure or petition signing would change the palace's position. The petition organisers attempted to escalate, seeking to bring the matter before Parliament through sympathetic MPs, approaching the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to investigate whether the secrecy violated the rights of descendants of enslaved people, and launching a legal challenge under freedom of information laws. All of these efforts failed. The government declined to intervene in what it characterised as a private property matter. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission stated it had no jurisdiction over private historical research, and the Freedom of Information challenge was rejected on grounds that Gatcombe Park was private property and that the royal household was not subject to FOI requests in matters unrelated to official duties. The story faded from the news cycle within a few months, as stories do, displaced by newer controversies and more immediate concerns. But the questions persist, and the underlying tension remains unresolved. Gatcombe Park continues to sit at the intersection of private property rights, royal privilege, historical justice, and public interest in ways that our society has not fully worked out how to handle. What makes this silence particularly striking is that it stands in such contrast to how other British institutions have handled their connections to slavery. When the National Trust, which manages hundreds of historic properties across Britain, discovered that many of its houses were built on slave trade profits, it didn't seal the records and refused to discuss it. Instead, it commissioned extensive research into which properties had slavery connections, published detailed reports openly acknowledging these connections, and created interpretive materials to help visitors understand this history. Houses like Penrhyn Castle in Wales, built on profits from Jamaican sugar plantations worked by enslaved people, now have exhibitions that explicitly discuss this origin. The same is true for Harewood House in Yorkshire, for Tintersfield in Somerset, and for numerous other properties. When the University of Cambridge discovered that numerous colleges had been endowed with fortunes from the slave trade, it didn't hide the evidence. It established the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, which has created comprehensive databases of slave ownership, mapped the geographic spread of British slavery, and documented the ways that slave trade wealth flowed into British institutions. Oxford has undertaken similar work through its Colonial Countryside project. When the Church of England realised the extent of its historical involvement in slavery, including that the Church had itself owned enslaved people on its estates in Barbados, it didn't deny or conceal this history. It appointed an oversight group to research the Church's slavery connections, committed to making reparations through various programs, and issued formal apologies for the Church's role. Even the royal family itself has acknowledged historical connections to slavery in other contexts. In 2023, during a visit to Kenya, then Prince Charles, now King Charles III, spoke of the abhorrent and unjustifiable acts of violence committed against Kenyans during British colonial rule, and expressed greatest sorrow and the deepest regret for these events. The message was carefully crafted to express regret without accepting legal liability, but it represented an acknowledgement that the British establishment, including the monarchy, bore some responsibility for colonial atrocities. But Gatcombe Park remains different. Perhaps it is because the evidence here is not just documentary but physical, not just ledgers and bills of sale that can be acknowledged abstractly, but actual spaces where actual crimes may have occurred, actual human remains that provide tangible proof of suffering. Perhaps it is because the property is still an active royal residence rather than a museum or historic site managed at arm's length. Perhaps it is because the tunnel system itself presents genuine security concerns that make it difficult to open for investigation. Or perhaps it is simply because what lies in those sealed tunnels is simply too disturbing, too direct a connection to Britain's darkest history to be safely acknowledged. The estate today presents a carefully curated image that obscures this dark history. Aerial photographs show beautiful parkland, elegant Georgian architecture, well-maintained grounds. The Princess Royal's public engagements at Gatcombe, particularly the annual Gatcombe horse trials, show a working equestrian estate devoted to breeding and training horses. Media coverage focuses on the princess's tireless work for her many charities, her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, and her privacy-loving nature. Everything on the surface is respectable, even admirable, but beneath her feet, as she walks across those lawns or rides through the parkland, lies a network of tunnels and chambers that tell a very different story. A story of wealth built on human suffering, of people held in underground chambers far from help or hope, of crimes committed and then sealed away, of secrets kept for 2.5 centuries through a combination of family loyalty, legal restrictions, and deliberate destruction of evidence. The house glows golden in the morning light, its proportions perfect and its facade unblemished. The gardens bloom with carefully chosen plants. The horses graze peacefully in the fields, but the past remains, buried but not gone, waiting for the day when someone with the authority and the courage to do so decides that the time has come to open those sealed chambers and confront what they contain. That day seems far off. The current Princess Royal shows no sign of permitting any investigation. King Charles III, who might have the authority to order one, seems equally uninterested in forcing the issue. The British government treats it as a private matter outside its jurisdiction. The trust established by Edward Shepherd continues to fund maintenance of the seals, and so Gatcombe Park continues its dual existence. On the surface, a beautiful Georgian house and a model country estate. Beneath, a repository of secrets about slavery, violence, and the human cost of Georgian elegance. Historians and activists who continue to push for access face an uphill battle against formidable obstacles. Property rights in England are strong, particularly for wealthy families with good legal representation. Official secrecy laws can be invoked to classify information and threaten prosecution for disclosure. The royal household has essentially infinite resources to fight legal challenges and to shape media coverage. And most fundamentally, there is no clear legal mechanism to compel a private property owner, even a royal one, to permit historical investigation they don't want to allow. So, the most secret royal residence in Britain keeps its secrets, a beautiful house that refuses to acknowledge the darkness at its foundation. Princess Anne will eventually pass the property to her son Peter Phillips or her daughter Zara Tyndall, and the next generation of the family will face the same choices about whether to maintain the secrecy or to finally allow investigation. Perhaps at some point in the future, when the current generation is gone and the political sensitivities have shifted, someone will decide that the historical importance of documenting what happened at Gatcombe Park outweighs the risks of disclosure. Perhaps those sealed chambers will be opened, their contents documented and preserved, and the full story told at last. But that day is not today, and it probably won't come for decades. For now, Britain's most secret royal residence remains exactly that, a house worth over £200 million that has never opened its doors to the public, whose tunnels remain sealed and unexplored, whose dark history is known in outline but not in detail, whose secrets are guarded by layers of legal protection, royal privilege, and official secrecy. Edward Shepherd built Gatcombe Park as a monument to his wealth and success, and in one sense he succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. His house remains standing 2.5 centuries later, home to royalty, more valuable than ever. But he also created a monument to the human cost of that wealth, a physical reminder that Georgian elegance and classical beauty could be built on foundations of slavery and suffering, that the same man who could appreciate fine architecture and collect tasteful art could also profit from the sale of human beings, and might have held people in chains beneath his elegant drawing rooms. The past is quite literally under the surface at Gatcombe Park, buried in sealed chambers 50 feet below the beautiful Georgian facade, waiting for the day when it can no longer be denied. That day will come, eventually. History has a way of refusing to stay buried, of breaking through the seals and protections that people erect to conceal uncomfortable truths. The question is not whether Gatcombe Park's secrets will be revealed, but when and under what circumstances, and what we will do with the knowledge when it finally emerges into the light.